broad and deep, carrying countless souls along its current. Some navigate it with a steady hand, understanding the tides and the hidden rocks beneath the surface, while others drift aimlessly, believing that mere effort, persistence, or loyalty to convention will be enough to keep them afloat. I want you to hold that image in your mind as we dive into what so many in the middle class fail to see. A series of subtle, almost invisible traps that quietly keep them from true financial freedom. These aren't the flashy mistakes you hear about in magazines or see in the latest online guru videos. These are the slow, almost imperceptible errors that accumulate over years, compounding quietly like interest in a savings account that never grows. And let me tell you something straight away. The reason most people don't notice these mistakes is because society tells them the opposite. It praises cautiousness, celebrates modest ambition, and tells people that simply working hard and saving will inevitably lead to prosperity. But hard work without understanding, caution without insight, and saving without intelligence often ends in a life that is comfortable in appearance but fragile at its core. You see, my friend, the middle class is not poor because they don't work or because they are lazy. They are poor because they have been educated to think in ways that ensure mediocrity, and in doing so they walk a narrow path where financial freedom is always just out of reach. And that, in itself, is a tragedy, because the intelligence and energy are there, but they are misdirected. The first mistake, which is almost universal, is the failure to understand the true power of capital. People in the middle class are taught to exchange time for money, to trade hours of labor for a paycheck, without ever appreciating that money, when properly allocated, is capable of working for you in ways your labor never could. They see their salary, their small bonuses, their 401k contributions, and imagine that these are the pillars of financial success. But the truth is more nuanced and, frankly, more unsettling. A paycheck is a treadmill. You can run as fast as you want, but unless you redirect a portion of your resources into productive assets, you remain confined to the treadmill, exhausted but unchanged in your financial position. Charlie Munger often reminds us that acquiring worldly wisdom is more about learning to recognize patterns and incentives than memorizing formulas. And the middle-class mindset is riddled with a failure to see the incentives behind their own behaviors. They spend on things they don't need, take on liabilities dressed as assets, and neglect the compounding power of investments that could grow quietly for decades. The tragedy is that it's not malice or stupidity at play here. It's the subtle influence of habit and culture guiding them toward choices that feel safe but are financially suicidal in the long run. Another deeply ingrained mistake is what I call the worship of security. Now, I'm not speaking against prudence, far from it, but there is a peculiar obsession in middle-class thinking that equates risk with danger, that makes people avoid opportunities simply because they are uncomfortable. They cling to stable jobs, buy homes beyond their means, and load themselves with insurance policies, all under the illusion that these choices protect them. The reality is that, in avoiding risk, they often miss the only types of calculated risk that actually generate wealth. Security without growth is stagnation dressed in comforting colors. Munger has often said that rationality, combined with patience and understanding of incentives, trumps both courage and boldness alone. Yet the middle-class individual, guided by societal norms, becomes paralyzed by the fear of losing what little they have, failing to understand that wealth rarely grows in the absence of bold, informed decisions. And so, The river we spoke of earlier seems calm on the surface, but underneath these invisible forces are dragging them away from the currents that lead to real financial independence. The second mistake, and one that quietly erodes potential over decades, is the overvaluation of consumption disguised as status. People in the middle class are constantly bombarded with images of what success should look like: shiny cars, sprawling homes, vacations to far-off lands, the latest gadgets, designer labels, and they chase these symbols, believing that outward appearances are equivalent to real achievement. But here's the inconvenient truth that many never face. Consumption is the silent tax on your future. Every dollar spent on a fleeting thrill, a momentary validation, or a piece of status theater is a dollar that could have been invested, multiplied, and allowed to grow into genuine wealth. The middle-class mindset convinces people that financial discipline is boring, that delayed gratification is un-American or unfulfilled. And yet, history and common sense tell us that those who master the art of patience, who prioritize assets over trinkets, invariably build freedom. I remember, as Munger often illustrates through his crisp, almost surgical analogies, that people who seem normal and live comfortably are, in fact, often ensnared by invisible chains of their own making, chains forged from monthly payments, lifestyle inflation, and the constant need to sig. Null to the world that they are successful. They confuse money with meaning, and the world, ever eager to reinforce that illusion, applauds them for it. Then there is the subtle, yet devastating mistake of failing to think in multiple time horizons simultaneously. People earn today, plan vaguely for tomorrow, and rarely consider the compounding effect of decades of intelligent decisions, or the catastrophic consequences of decades of small, foolish ones. They focus obsessively on immediate needs or superficial achievements, while ignoring the accumulation of advantages or liabilities over time. Munger has long emphasized the virtue of understanding not only what decisions produce immediate outcomes, but how those outcomes ripple through years, sometimes decades, ahead. Yet the average middle-class individual makes choices that satisfy today's ego and convenience, not tomorrow's security and growth. They pick homes that look nice, careers that feel respectable, and investments that sound safe, all while ignoring the long arc of compounding. And this is why a lifetime of hard work often ends in financial mediocrity. The right decisions, repeated over decades, are far more powerful than heroic acts of effort concentrated in brief periods. But recognizing this requires mental models, foresight, and patience, qualities seldom taught in schools or celebrated in culture. Finally, in this segment, we confront perhaps the most psychologically complex of these mistakes: the inability to confront one's own cognitive biases. Humans, and particularly middle-class humans, are prone to self-deception in subtle ways. We tell ourselves stories that justify our spending, rationalize our choices, and convince ourselves that luck or destiny, rather than our habits, will determine our outcomes. Munger calls this the psychology of human misjudgment, and it is precisely this misjudgment that ensures financial mediocrity. People overestimate their understanding of markets, underestimate their susceptibility to social pressures, and cling to mental models that were never designed for wealth creation. They invest emotionally, borrow impulsively, and live in a constant state of postponed reflection. And here's the cruel irony: By avoiding the discomfort of honest self-examination, they also avoid the rare but transformative insight that could redirect their entire trajectory. It is not dramatic mistakes that keep them poor. It is the quiet accumulation of minor misjudgments repeated over decades, compounded by the comforting illusions of societal validation. The third mistake, which is deeply intertwined with all the others, is the failure to truly understand opportunity cost. Middle-class thinking often revolves around a mistaken sense of what I can afford rather than what is worth sacrificing for. People will spend hours negotiating a small discount on a new car while completely ignoring the decades of compounding growth they could have achieved if that money had been allocated to productive assets. They think in terms of immediate trade-offs without considering the invisible, long-term consequences of every decision. Munger always emphasizes the importance of thinking in probabilistic terms and understanding the full consequences of an action, not just the obvious or immediate outcome. Yet most middle-class individuals live in a world of convenience and nearsightedness, calculating only the superficial benefits of a purchase or a career move and ignoring the hidden costs, the hours lost to commuting, the interest accrued on credit, the compounding opportunity slipping through their fingers while they are distracted by the illusion of normality. The river of life continues to flow, but their gaze is fixed on the bank right in front of them, never realizing that the current is taking them farther from their true destination. Opportunity cost is subtle, almost invisible, and that is precisely why it is so dangerous. It's not that people aren't capable of understanding it, they are, but they have been conditioned by culture and upbringing to undervalue it, to ignore the long-term arithmetic of wealth in favor of short-term psychological comfort. Another layer of this same mistake is the misallocation of personal energy. Middle-class individuals are often dazzled by titles, prestige, and appearances. They pour their time, mental bandwidth, and emotional energy into maintaining a facade rather than developing skills or acquiring knowledge that could generate wealth autonomously. Munger has a saying, "Spend each day trying to be a little wiser than you were when you woke up. Discharge your duties faithfully and well. Step by step you get ahead, but not necessarily in fast spurts." Yet the middle-class mindset often reverses this logic, seeking immediate rewards for superficial displays of effort. They work long hours at jobs that teach them little, engage in endless social signaling, and buy products that promise status instead of value. In the process, they neglect the one thing that truly compounds: intellectual and skill-based capital. Wealth isn't built by running in circles. It's built by applying your mental and financial energy in ways that multiply over time, and the failure to do so is a quiet, relentless poverty trap. And then there is the almost paradoxical mistake of avoiding responsibility for one's own financial education. Middle-class culture is comfortable with the idea of experts and advisors. People delegate critical decisions about their money to brokers, financial planners, or well-meaning friends, believing that outsourcing judgment absolves them of risk. But Munger, and indeed history itself, teaches that true wisdom comes from understanding, not delegation. No one can care more about your money than you, and no one sees the long-term compounding effects of your decisions more clearly than a mind trained to think in multiple time frames simultaneously. By avoiding responsibility, middle-class individuals surrender the one lever that can pull them out of mediocrity. It is not laziness in the conventional sense. It is a slow erosion of agency, a failure to cultivate the mental models that allow one to perceive incentives, patterns, and compounding effects that operate quietly behind the scenes of everyday life. And the tragic part is that this failure is rarely acknowledged. The system encourages dependence on external authorities, promising security while quietly ensuring that true wealth remains elusive. The fourth mistake is subtler still, yet perhaps the most emotionally insidious: the chronic underestimation of patience and the overestimation of speed. The middle-class mind is trained to crave instant gratification, to measure success in quarterly performance, annual bonuses, or the approval of peers. People want results fast, expecting wealth to arrive like a sudden windfall or a lucky break, and they grow frustrated when decades of patient, disciplined action fail to produce immediate drama. Charlie Munger has repeatedly pointed out that compounding is the most powerful force in the universe, yet it is invisible to those who do not understand it. The middle class, enthralled by immediacy, overlooks the fact that small, intelligent decisions repeated over decades far outweigh the occasional daring bet. They chase speculative trends, believe in the luck of timing markets, and ignore the quiet, almost imperceptible growth of patient investments or skill accumulation. It is the tyranny of impatience that ensures mediocrity. They act as though the river of life will wait for them to learn, to reflect, to compound their knowledge and capital. But the river flows relentlessly, and those who refuse patience find themselves stranded, exhausted by effort, yet untouched by true progress. Closely related to impatience is the failure to embrace discomfort. Wealth creation is not about avoiding pain. It is about learning to tolerate it, to lean into it, and to extract value from it. Middle-class individuals are often guided by the principle of comfort, seeking cushioned routines, insulated careers, and predictable lifestyles. They avoid friction, failure, and uncertainty, believing that these are inherently dangerous. Munger, in his clarity, reminds us that every successful person he knows encountered setbacks, endured the discomfort of learning, and cultivated the discipline to endure repetition and delay. The middle-class mistake is thinking that life should be comfortable while simultaneously aspiring to freedom and wealth. Comfort and wealth rarely coexist in the early stages. One requires deferred gratification, courage in the face of uncertainty, and the willingness to study and act when others are fearful or indifferent. The emotional avoidance of discomfort keeps millions trapped in safe routines that feel secure but lead inexorably to stagnation. It is a silent thief, stealing potential and keeping the river from ever carrying them toward meaningful abundance. Another subtle but pervasive error is the over-reliance on linear thinking in a world dominated by exponential forces. Most middle-class financial habits assume that life, income, and growth are linear. Earn a little more each year, save a little more each month, and eventually, by simple addition, one will arrive at wealth. But the universe of money, knowledge, and human incentives rarely operates in straight lines. Compounding, network effects, business scale, and psychological leverage are exponential. They multiply quietly, invisibly, and over time. Middle-class individuals often fail to internalize this principle. They make decisions that look reasonable on a small scale. A safe job, a predictable investment, moderate spending, but they ignore the rare opportunities that could yield exponential growth if approached rationally and patiently. Munger repeatedly stresses the importance of avoiding small stupidity and cultivating a latticework of mental models to perceive nonlinear patterns. Yet the middle class is conditioned to value convention over insight, immediacy over compounding, and comfort over calculated risk. The result is a life that feels safe, respectable, and normal, yet is quietly distant from the wealth it could have achieved. The fifth mistake, one that quietly undermines both wealth and freedom, is the failure to recognize the difference between assets and liabilities. Middle-class culture, with its emphasis on appearances and social validation, often teaches people to equate ownership with wealth. A large house, a luxury car, or a portfolio of trendy collectibles is assumed to be a sign of financial health. But Munger teaches us that wealth is measured not by what you own, but by what you control and what produces for you over time. A liability drains resources, an asset generates them, and the middle-class individual frequently confuses the two, aiding themselves with items that appear valuable, yet consume time, energy, and money. They take out loans to maintain a lifestyle that signals success, but generates no real compounding. They work tirelessly to pay for things that will never return anything, while neglecting to acquire things that could generate enduring value, whether in the form of productive investments, intellectual property, or skills that compound over decades. This misalignment of perception and reality is subtle, almost invisible, and therefore remarkably effective at keeping people trapped. The irony is that those who diligently study their own finances learn to distinguish between assets and liabilities, and focus relentlessly on the former, rarely feel constrained by money, even if they live modestly, while those who chase the illusion of wealth find themselves exhausted and perpetually anxious. Layered atop this is the error of ignoring the multiplier effect of human relationships and reputation. Middle-class individuals often approach relationships in transactional ways or neglect to cultivate networks that could amplify their knowledge, opportunities, or access to resources. Munger has long emphasized the power of reliable, trustworthy, and wise companions in life and business. Success is rarely a solo endeavor. It accumulates in the space where talent, trust, and opportunity intersect. Yet middle-class thinking undervalues this, treating relationships as peripheral rather than central to compounding influence. People chase short-term gains or social prestige instead of nurturing the slow accumulation of trust and goodwill that can generate exponential returns over decades. The river flows not just because of individual effort, but because of alliances, reputation, and the invisible currents created by collective wisdom. Ignoring these forces is like trying to swim upstream against a tiddy. You have missed opportunities that could have carried you far with minimal effort. Finally, the fifth major mistake is the failure to adopt a mindset of continuous learning and adjustment. Middle-class individuals are often content with what they know, what they have mastered superficially, and what is socially recognized as competent. They stop questioning, stop exploring, and stop evolving. But as Munger reminds us, the world is a complex, dynamic system, and what worked yesterday may fail tomorrow. The failure to adapt, to constantly improve mental models, to scrutinize incentives and consequences, ensures that people repeat patterns of mediocrity throughout life. They invest emotionally, make assumptions based on habit, and cling to routines long after they have ceased to serve them. True financial freedom and true independence of thought requires relentless curiosity, rigorous self-examination, and the willingness to abandon comforting illusions. And it is precisely this stagnation, dressed in the guise of competence and stability, that keeps the river from ever carrying the middle class to abundance. The sixth and perhaps most insidious mistake is the failure to integrate all of these lessons into a coherent philosophy of life and wealth. It is not enough to understand compounding, avoid liabilities, tolerate discomfort, and think long-term in isolation. The true trap lies in the fragmented understanding of these principles. Middle-class individuals often adopt pieces of wisdom superficially, following advice here and there without truly internalizing it, without creating a consistent, disciplined approach that guides every decision. They know, in theory, that saving and investing is important, that patience compounds wealth, and that assets outperform liabilities. But in practice, they drift, guided by impulse, social pressure, or the temporary illusion of security. Munger repeatedly emphasizes the importance of worldly wisdom, which comes not from isolated facts, but from the ability to synthesize knowledge across disciplines and apply it rationally. The middle class, distracted by immediate gratifications, the social validation of peers, and the fear of minor risks, fails to build this latticework of understanding. Without it, each decision is made in a vacuum, disconnected from the compounding effects of knowledge, capital, and human relationships. And this is where the tragedy becomes most visible. It is not dramatic blunders or catastrophic failures that keep people in mediocrity. It is the quiet, relentless accumulation of small errors, repeated over decades, compounded by society's approval of those choices. They take the safe career, buy the safe house, spend money on things that provide fleeting comfort, avoid the discomfort that teaches resilience, and outsource their judgment to advisors or peers. They live in a life that feels normal, respectable, and even enviable from the outside, yet underneath, the river carries them farther from independence, farther from the financial freedom they could have had, and farther from the satisfaction of mastering their own destiny. Every missed insight, every unlearned lesson, every poorly directed effort grows quietly into a gap that widens with time. The cumulative effect is a life of labor without leverage, of comfort without freedom, and of respectability without true wealth. And yet there is hope, because all of these mistakes, while subtle and pervasive, are also teachable, correctable, and avoidable. Recognizing them is the first step, but the next is cultivating patience, humility, and a willingness to question not only the world around you, but your own ingrained habits, assumptions, and biases. The river is still flowing, and it carries the potential for abundance for anyone willing to step off the treadmill, study the currents, and align their actions with the invisible forces that generate wealth over decades. Munger often stresses that intelligence is not enough without temperament, and temperament without understanding is meaningless. True financial wisdom comes from combining these elements, the mental models to see reality clearly, the patience to allow compounding to operate, and the courage to act where others hesitate. It is not glamorous, it is not instantaneous, and it rarely attracts attention, but it works. And the middle class, when willing to confront these mistakes, can escape the traps that have held generations captive. In conclusion, the path from mediocrity to true financial freedom is less about luck, inheritance, or extraordinary talent, and far more about understanding the quiet, compounding forces that govern life, money, and human behavior. The middle-class mistakes we've explored: trading time for money without leveraging capital, chasing status over substance, overvaluing security, failing to think long-term, misunderstanding assets versus liabilities, underestimating patience, and neglecting continuous learning are not sins of character. They are the predictable byproducts of cultural conditioning, societal approval, and human psychology. And the good news is that recognizing them is the first step toward liberation. Once you see the river for what it is, once you understand the invisible currents beneath the surface, you gain the power to steer rather than drift. True wealth, as Charlie Munger would remind us, is the accumulation of wisely applied knowledge, disciplined action, and patience, compounded over decades. It is built not by chasing fleeting pleasures or following the crowd, but by thinking rationally, learning relentlessly, and embracing the discomfort that growth demands. Every decision becomes a lever, every sacrifice an investment, every insight a potential multiplier for the decades to come. The middle-class mistakes are traps, yes, but they are traps that can be dismantled by careful thought, courage, and an unflinching commitment to reality. And in doing so, a life that once seemed confined by limitations transforms into a river of possibilities, steady, deep, and carrying you toward freedom, independence, and a fulfillment that cannot be measured by appearances or societal applause. The message is simple, yet profound. Do not let convention dictate your choices. Do not let fear obscure opportunity. And above all, do not mistake comfort for success. Wealth, in its truest sense, is created by the patient, the disciplined, and the wise. The river is moving. Step in deliberately, learn its patterns, and allow your actions compounded over time to carry you to a life that most only imagine but few ever achieve.